The saddest thing about broken souls is this: most of them stop asking to be saved. Before we begin, write in the comments where you are watching from tonight. And if you have ever seen an animal choose a person before that person even understood he needed saving, subscribe to the channel now and stay with me until the very last breath of this story. Because what happened inside Silver Pine's rescue on that frozen Montana night was not just an adoption. It was the night two abandoned souls recognized each other in a room full of noise, and one silent dog reminded a broken man that sometimes the life you think is over is only waiting for someone brave enough to knock on the door again. The shelter smelled like bleach, wet concrete, and old rain trapped in winter coats. Somewhere near the front office, a metal kennel door slammed shut with a sharp echo that rolled through the building like a warning. Dogs barked from every direction. Loud, desperate, hopeful. Some jumped against chain-link gates hard enough to rattle the bolts loose. Others spun in circles, tails wagging wildly each time footsteps passed their cages. Every sound inside Silver Pine's rescue carried the same plea. Pick me. Please pick me. But in the farthest corner of the oldest kennel row, beneath a flickering fluorescent light that buzzed softly like dying electricity, one German shepherd sat perfectly still. He did not bark. He did not move toward the gate. He did not lift his head when visitors walked past. It was almost unsettling, the way he sat there facing the concrete wall as if the world behind him no longer existed. His sable coat, once thick and beautiful, looked dull beneath the pale light. Dark fur stretched across his back like burnt ash after a fire. His ribs showed faintly beneath his sides. One ear tilted slightly lower than the other, not injured, just tired somehow. Exhausted in a way deeper than sleep. A small laminated sign hung crookedly beside the kennel door. Do not approach. Another paper beneath it carried faded black marker written by someone who had clearly stopped trying to make the words sound hopeful. Male German Shepherd. Approximately 5 years old. No aggression. No response. The volunteers called him Ash because nobody knew his real name anymore. One teenage worker whispered he had been found alone inside an abandoned foreclosure outside Missoula during early snowfall nearly 7 months earlier. Another claimed the dog had belonged to a veteran who never came home. Nobody knew which story was true. What they did know was this: Ash had not barked in 217 days. Not once. No growl. No whine. No cry. Nothing. He ate only after everyone left the room. He slept facing corners. And every time someone tried to touch him, he simply drifted farther away inside himself. Poor thing's already gone, one volunteer murmured quietly while refilling water bowls near the hallway. Body just hasn't caught up yet. Outside, Montana winter pressed against the shelter windows in pale gray sheets. Snow drifted sideways beneath the parking lot lamps while cold wind scraped dead leaves across the asphalt. The heater inside the building clicked and groaned constantly, fighting a battle it was slowly losing. The whole place felt tired. Like every lonely thing in the county eventually ended up here. Around 5:40 p.m., the front door opened with a tired squeal. A burst of freezing air swept through the lobby carrying the scent of pine trees, road salt, and distant wood smoke. The receptionist barely looked up from her paperwork. We're closing in 20 minutes, she called automatically. The man who stepped inside nodded once. I won't stay long. His voice was calm, low, rough around the edges like gravel under boots. Ethan Cole stood about 6'2" with the broad shoulders of someone who once carried heavy things for a living. A faded olive jacket hung over a dark thermal shirt, sleeves rolled just enough to reveal black ink curling along his right forearm. The tattoo showed the detailed face of a German shepherd beneath military script worn soft by time. Snow melted slowly from his boots onto the tile floor. His dark brown hair was trimmed short, military neat even after years away from service, though silver had begun touching the edges near his temples. A second tattoo disappeared beneath the collar near the left side of his neck. Another. Shepherd. Same amber eyes. Ethan looked like a man who had once been hard to surprise. But exhaustion sat behind his gray-blue eyes now, the kind that sleep never fixes. He wasn't there to adopt a dog. Truthfully, Ethan hadn't even planned to stop. Earlier that afternoon, he'd attended another PTSD support meeting across town inside the basement of a Lutheran church where stale coffee sat untouched beside folded paper cups. He lasted 37 minutes before leaving. Too many people trying to explain pain out loud. Too many forced smiles. Too many phrases like healing journey and safe space. So he drove. No destination. Just empty roads cutting through frozen trees until he noticed the shelter lights glowing against the storm. Maybe he only wanted somewhere warm for a few minutes before going home to the silence waiting in his cabin. The receptionist finally glanced up. Looking for a specific breed? Ethan shook his head once. Just donating these. He lifted a cardboard box filled with unopened dog food, old blankets, chew toys still carrying store tags. Leftovers from storage. That's kind of you. Kind. Ethan almost smiled at the word. Funny how people used it when they didn't know what else to call grief. Somewhere deeper in the shelter, barking exploded again as another volunteer passed through the kennel rows. Ethan's shoulders stiffened instinctively at the noise. Then, just as suddenly, something else caught his attention. Silence. One corner of the building had none of it. No barking. No scratching. No movement at all. Ethan turned his head slowly toward the dark hallway stretching behind the office. You keep one separated? He asked quietly. The receptionist hesitated. That's Ash. Aggressive. No. She looked down briefly before answering the next part. Honestly, he just doesn't care anymore. Ethan said nothing. Something about those words stayed in the air between them longer than they should have. The heater rattled overhead. Snow tapped softly against the windows. And somewhere beyond the flickering hallway light, a silent German shepherd sat facing the wall like he had already disappeared from the world before anyone noticed he was gone. Ethan did not answer right away. He kept staring toward the dark hallway where the silence seemed almost unnatural now that he noticed it. Every other sound inside the shelter faded strangely around it. Barking, metal gates clanging, a ringing office phone somewhere near the back. Yet that single quiet kennel sat apart from the rest of the world like winter itself had settled there and refused to leave. The receptionist cleared her throat softly. Most people avoid that section. Ethan finally looked at her. Why? She shrugged, though the sadness behind her eyes suggested she already knew the answer too well. People come here wanting happy dogs. Tail waggers. Dogs that run up to them like they have known them forever. She glanced toward the hallway. Ash just sits there. Ethan slid his hands into the pockets of his jacket. Maybe he is tired. The woman gave a faint smile that disappeared almost immediately. Maybe. Snow hissed softly against the windows while the shelter heater rattled overhead. Ethan should have left then. He knew it. The roads would ice over soon, and his cabin sat nearly 40 minutes outside town near Flathead Lake, where the trees grew thick enough to swallow headlights whole after dark. But his boots stayed planted on the tile floor. Something about that silence kept pulling at him. Not curiosity. Recognition. He knew what it looked like when something inside a living thing stopped reaching outward. He had seen it in Marines sitting alone after deployment. Seen it in mirrors, too. Can I see him? He asked quietly. The receptionist hesitated long enough for Ethan to notice. You can, she said carefully. Just do not expect anything. Ethan nodded once and started down the hallway. The deeper he walked into the kennel wing, the colder the building seemed to become. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead in uneven intervals, washing the narrow corridor in pale white pulses. Rows of dogs barked as he passed. A Labrador threw itself joyfully against its gate. A beagle spun excited circles. Somewhere farther back, a husky let out a dramatic howl that echoed through the concrete halls. Ethan kept walking. Then slowly, one by one, the sounds faded behind him. The final kennel sat near the end beneath a dim light buzzing softly above the chain link enclosure. Ash remained exactly where Ethan had imagined him, facing the wall, motionless. The German shepherd looked larger up close, though painfully thin beneath his winter coat. His sable fur carried shades of charcoal black and faded copper under the weak lighting. One paw rested carefully over the other as though he had been sitting in that same position for hours, maybe days. Ethan stopped several feet from the kennel door. Ash did not move, did not even flick an ear. The silence between them stretched long enough for Ethan to hear the heater ticking somewhere above the ceiling tiles. Hey, buddy, he said quietly. Nothing. Ethan crouched slowly near the gate. Old habit. Never loom over an animal carrying fear. Ash remained still. The dog's breathing was slow and steady, almost too calm. Ethan noticed scars hidden beneath the fur along his shoulder. Not fresh. Old life marks. The kind nobody ever fully explains. You military? Ethan murmured softly, almost to himself. There it was. The smallest reaction. Barely visible. One ear twitched. Ethan's chest tightened unexpectedly. He leaned back slightly against the concrete wall beside the kennel and exhaled through his nose. Yeah, he muttered. Me too. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Somewhere far behind them, a volunteer laughed faintly near the front office. It sounded distant. Like another world entirely. Ethan sat there for nearly 2 minutes without speaking again. He did not know why. Maybe because silence had become easier than conversation years ago. Maybe because this dog understood that better than most people ever could. Finally, Ash moved. Not much. Just enough to slowly lift his head a fraction higher from the wall. Ethan felt it immediately. Attention. Careful. Fragile. The dog was listening now. Ethan swallowed once before speaking again. I had a shepherd once. His voice came lower this time, roughened by memory. Name was Ranger. Ash did not turn around, but his breathing changed almost imperceptibly. Ethan stared at the concrete floor while snow continued, tapping softly against the shelter windows. Smartest dog I ever knew, he said quietly. Could detect explosives before the equipment picked up anything. A faint smile touched the corner of Ethan's mouth, though grief sat behind it like a shadow. Saved 6 men outside Kandahar. The smile disappeared just as quickly. The silence returned heavier now. Ethan rubbed a hand slowly across the tattoo on his forearm without thinking. The shepherd inked there looked almost identical to the dog inside the kennel. Same alert ears. Same intelligent eyes. Same loyalty frozen permanently beneath skin because memory hurt less when it had shape. Ash finally shifted again. Slow. Careful. One paw sliding slightly across the concrete floor. Ethan looked up. The dog was not facing the wall completely anymore. Just enough movement for one amber eye to become visible beneath the dim light. And for the first time since entering the shelter, Ethan understood why the volunteers spoke about Ash in whispers. It was not fear in that dog's eyes. It was absence. Like watching someone stand in an empty house after everyone else already left. Ethan felt something uncomfortable twist inside his chest. Recognition again. He knew that look. God, he knew it too well. The heater groaned loudly overhead before falling silent. Cold air drifted through the hallway. Ash blinked once, slowly, then lowered his head again. But he did not fully turn back toward the wall this time. Ethan noticed that immediately. So did the older volunteer walking past the hallway carrying folded towels. She stopped abruptly when she saw the kennel. Wait, she whispered softly. Ethan glanced back toward her. The woman stared wide-eyed at Ash before looking at Ethan again. He turned around. Ethan looked back at the dog. Only slightly. Barely enough for most people to notice. But it mattered. The volunteer stepped closer carefully, lowering her voice as though afraid to break something fragile in the air. He has not done that for anyone. Ethan looked at Ash again. The shepherd kept his gaze low, exhausted, uncertain, but no longer completely hidden from the world. And somehow, in that freezing shelter hallway beneath, dying fluorescent lights, it felt less like a breakthrough and more like the first tiny crack in a door that had been locked from the inside for a very long time. The older volunteer kept staring into the kennel as though she had just witnessed something impossible. Her name tag read Martha, the letters faded and scratched from years of use. She clutched the folded towels tighter against her chest, while Ash remained motionless beneath the dim light. One amber eye still visible now instead of buried against the wall. I have worked here 11 years, she whispered softly. That dog does not look at people. Ethan slowly rose to his feet, joints stiff from crouching on concrete. Maybe he just did. Martha shook her head faintly, still watching Ash with disbelief written across her tired face. No, she murmured. You do not understand. The shelter lights flickered once overhead. Somewhere near the front entrance, the receptionist locked the outer doors with a metallic click that echoed down the hallway. Closing time. Snowstorm winds groaned outside the building, rattling the old window frames hard enough to make the glass tremble. Martha lowered her voice even more. The first month we got him here, he used to sit by the kennel door every night. Ethan glanced toward her while Ash remained silent behind the chain-link gate. Waiting for someone? Martha nodded slowly. At first, yes. Her eyes softened with memory. Every set of footsteps made him stand up. Every car in the parking lot. Every voice. She swallowed quietly before continuing. Then one day he just stopped. Ethan looked back toward the dog. Ash had lowered his head slightly again, though not fully toward the wall anymore. It was subtle, almost invisible unless someone truly watched him. But the difference remained. The shepherd had shifted toward the world, even if only by an inch. Martha sighed softly. "You know what breaks your heart around here?" she asked. Ethan stayed quiet. "It is not the aggressive dogs. Not the sick ones. It is the hopeful ones." The old heater kicked on again overhead with a low mechanical rumble. Warm air drifted weakly into the hallway, carrying the scent of dust and damp fur. "Because eventually," Martha continued, "you see the exact moment hope leaves their eyes." Ethan did not answer. He understood too well. Martha finally stepped back from the kennel. "We close at 6, she said gently. "But you are welcome to stay another few minutes if you want." Ethan gave a quiet nod. "Thanks." Martha did not usually bend rules for visitors. Shelters learned caution the hard way. Strangers could promise warmth and disappear by morning. Good intentions could hurt almost as badly as cruelty when nobody followed through. But there was something about the way Ethan kept his distance from the kennel that made her pause. He was not trying to win the dog over. He was not filming the sad animal for sympathy. He was not calling Ash beautiful in that bright, careless voice people used before moving on to puppies. He was simply sitting there as if silence deserved respect. So Martha made a decision she would later describe as instinct. She told the receptionist to leave the hallway lights on for 10 more minutes. She checked the weather alert on her phone, saw the red warning crawling across the screen, and quietly placed a folded wool blanket on the bench near the staff door. Not an invitation yet, just preparation. Old shelter workers knew storms changed things. Sometimes they trapped people. Sometimes they revealed them. She hesitated before walking away. "He listened to your voice," she added softly over her shoulder. "That matters." Then she disappeared down the corridor, leaving Ethan alone again with the dog and the silence between them. Snow pressed harder against the windows now. The storm outside was growing heavier by the minute. Ethan leaned slowly against the concrete wall near the kennel, arms folded loosely across his chest. Ash remained still, though one ear angled faintly toward him now. Listening. Ethan let out a slow breath through his nose. "You know," he muttered quietly, "people used to tell me silence was unhealthy." Ash did not move. Said I should talk more. Ethan gave a faint, humorless smile. "Funny thing is, most people only want you talking if your words make them comfortable." The fluorescent light buzzed softly. Overhead, Ethan studied the shepherd carefully. Up close, Ash carried the same restrained alertness Ethan had seen in working dogs overseas. Even exhausted, even emotionally shut down, something inside him still tracked movement, still listened. Instinct survived where trust did not. Ethan understood that too. He rubbed a hand over the back of his neck slowly, fingers brushing the tattoo hidden beneath his collar. Another shepherd. Ranger. Always Ranger. There were nights Ethan still woke up hearing phantom breathing beside his bunk before remembering the dog had been gone nearly 4 years now. Funny how grief stayed loyal long after people learned to hide it. "He used to hate thunderstorms," Ethan said quietly after a long silence. Ash blinked once at the sound of Ethan's voice. Not scared exactly, just restless. Outside, thunder rolled faintly somewhere beyond the mountains as if summoned by memory itself. Ethan glanced toward the storm-dark windows. Every time lightning hit, he would walk circles around the barracks checking every door. The corner of Ethan's mouth twitched slightly, like it was his responsibility to hold the sky together. Ash shifted almost imperceptibly. One paw stretched forward along the concrete floor. Ethan noticed immediately. Tiny movement. Tiny trust. That was how broken things healed sometimes. Not loudly. Not all at once. Just enough to prove the soul inside had not fully disappeared yet. Ethan slowly crouched again, careful not to move too fast. The chain-link kennel door creaked softly beneath the pressure of his arm resting nearby. "I was not there when Ranger died," he admitted quietly. The words settled heavily in the cold air. Ethan rarely said them aloud. Maybe never to anyone fully. Medical evac got delayed. His jaw tightened briefly. By the time they reached him, he stopped. Ash remained still, but the shepherd's breathing slowed deeper now. Listening, Ethan stared at the floor between them. "That dog spent 6 years protecting people," he whispered. "And I still was not there when he needed somebody staying beside him." Silence wrapped around the kennel again. Not empty silence this time. Shared silence. The kind that asked for nothing. Ethan finally lifted his eyes toward Ash again. The shepherd was watching him now, fully, both amber eyes visible beneath the pale light. Tired eyes, guarded eyes, but present. Ethan felt his chest tighten unexpectedly at the sight. No fear, no aggression, just recognition. Two creatures sitting in the ruins of things they no longer knew how to carry. Somewhere near the front office, the lights switched off one section at a time as volunteers prepared to leave for the night. Shadows stretched longer across the hallway floor. Snow continued swirling outside beneath the parking lot lamps like drifting ash in the dark. Ethan should leave. He knew it, but neither he nor the dog moved. Finally, after several quiet moments, Ash did something so small most people would never understand why it mattered. He turned completely away from the wall. The movement was so slight, it almost felt sacred. Ash did not stand. He did not wag his tail or rush the kennel door the way happier dogs might have done. He simply turned his body fully toward Ethan for the first time in 7 months. And somehow that quiet gesture carried more weight than noise ever could. Ethan stayed perfectly still. Years around military working dogs had taught him patience mattered more than control. Trust could not be dragged into daylight. It had to walk there willingly. Ash studied him beneath the dim fluorescent glow, amber eyes reflecting faint gold against the shadows. Up close, Ethan could see the exhaustion carved deep into the shepherd's face. Not physical exhaustion alone. Something older. The kind that settled into living things after waiting too long for someone who never came back. Ethan knew that looked better than he wanted to admit. The heater clicked off again overhead. Cold crept slowly through the kennel hallway while snow continued spinning outside beyond the narrow windows near the ceiling. Somewhere near the front office, Martha's voice drifted faintly through the building as volunteers finished locking supply cabinets for the night. "You do not have to figure everything out tonight," Ethan murmured quietly toward the dog. Ash blinked once, but did not look. Away. Ethan leaned back against the concrete wall beside the kennel and stretched his legs carefully across the floor. His knees cracked softly with the movement. 38 years old, and every winter reminded him exactly how much military life had taken from the body even after the uniform came off. "Truth is," he said after a moment, "I am not very good around people anymore either." The confession came easier in the half-dark beside a silent dog. Ethan stared at the floor while speaking. "Crowds make me tired." His fingers traced absent circles against the faded tattoo on his forearm. "Noise makes my chest feel like something bad is about to happen." Ash remained motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his breathing. "Most days I drive into town because sitting alone at the cabin gets too quiet," Ethan admitted softly. "Then I get into town and remember I hate being around everybody." A faint smile touched his face for barely a second. Funny system. Outside, wind pushed snow hard against the building with a low hollow hiss. The shelter lights dimmed slightly as the storm strained the old electrical lines. Ethan glanced toward the windows near the ceiling. "You picked one hell of a night to finally notice somebody," he muttered. Ash lowered his head a fraction, ears twitching faintly at the sound of Ethan's voice. There it was again, listening, not shutting down anymore. Ethan noticed every tiny shift now the way wounded people often notice small signs in each other before anyone else does. A long silence settled comfortably between them. Not empty, just quiet in the way snowfall feels quiet deep in the woods. Ethan finally reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small object attached to a worn metal chain. Dog tags. The steel glinted softly beneath the fluorescent light. Ash's eyes followed the movement immediately. Ethan turned the tags slowly through his fingers. One belonged to him. The other had a paw print engraved beneath a single word. Ranger. The edges were scratched smooth from years of handling. Ethan stared at them without speaking for several seconds before exhaling slowly. "I kept thinking I would get another dog. Someday," he said quietly. "Everybody said it would help." His jaw tightened slightly. "But every time I tried walking into a shelter," he glanced toward Ash, "I left before making it past the front desk." The shepherd continued watching him now without retreating. Ethan swallowed once before continuing. Felt wrong somehow. He rubbed his thumb over the engraved paw print. Like replacing somebody who earned better than that. The old building groaned softly around them as another gust of wind swept through the storm outside. Somewhere farther down the hallway, one of the younger dogs barked nervously at the thunder rolling across the mountains. Ash flinched almost invisibly at the sound. Ethan noticed immediately. Trauma recognized trauma. Storms still bother you too, huh? He murmured. Ash's ears lowered slightly. Ethan looked down at the dog tags in his hand. Ranger used to pace during storms after Afghanistan. His voice softened beneath the weight of memory. Not fear. More like he was checking the perimeter. Ethan could almost smell desert dust for a second. Almost hear helicopter blades cutting through hot night air. The memory drifted across him slow and painful like old smoke. He stopped sleeping deeply after our second deployment. Ethan stared into the dim kennel shadows. I guess neither did I. Ash shifted carefully closer to the front of the kennel. Not much. Maybe 6 inches across the concrete floor. But enough for Ethan's breath to catch slightly in his chest. The shepherd's paws now rested near the chain-link gate, instead of hidden against the back wall. Ethan stayed still, barely even breathing. The fluorescent light above them flickered twice before stabilizing again. Ash lowered his nose slowly toward the bottom edge of the kennel gate where Ethan sat, testing the air. Scent mattered more than words to dogs. It always had. Ethan understood that too. The shepherd inhaled once, deeply. Then again. Ethan could feel something fragile happening between them now. Not excitement. Not sudden affection. Recognition. Familiar loneliness. Familiar grief. Familiar exhaustion carried quietly for too many years. Ash finally lifted his eyes toward Ethan again. And for the first time since arriving at Silver Pine's rescue, Ethan no longer saw emptiness there. He saw caution, pain, memory. But beneath all of it, buried deep and trembling faintly like the first ember inside cold ashes, he saw something else beginning to return. Trust. Then the shelter lights suddenly flickered hard. Once. Twice. And the entire building went dark. Darkness swallowed the shelter so completely that for one strange second Ethan thought he had gone deaf too. The constant fluorescent buzzing vanished. The heater died mid-rattle. Every sound inside the building disappeared beneath the sudden weight of the storm outside. Then somewhere down the hallway, dogs erupted into panicked barking all at once. Sharp cries echoed through the kennel rows as thunder rolled across the Montana mountains hard enough to shake the old windows. Ethan stayed perfectly still beside the kennel. Years of training settled into his body automatically. Do not react fast. Do not create more fear. A flashlight beam suddenly bounced through the distant hallway. Martha's voice echoed faintly from the front office. Backup generator should kick in soon. Another thunderclap cracked through the sky, closer this time. Several dogs began clawing anxiously against their kennel doors. Metal rattled violently down the corridor. Ethan glanced toward Ash instinctively. The shepherd had frozen. Every muscle locked tight beneath his sable coat. His ears flattened slightly against his head while his chest rose faster now with shallow, controlled breaths. Not panic exactly. Containment. Ethan recognized it immediately. Some fear ran loud. Some fear ran silent. The silent kind usually cut deeper. Easy, Ethan murmured softly into the darkness. The only light now came from weak emergency bulbs glowing dim red near the floor at the ends of the hallway. Their faint color painted the kennel corridor in long shadows and muted crimson haze. Ash remained near the gate, but lowered his head slightly, body tense as another burst of thunder rolled through the storm. Ethan sat carefully down on the concrete floor again, crossing one knee slowly to avoid sudden movement. "You are okay," he said quietly. The words came calm and low, almost the same tone soldiers used to steady each other when things outside became too loud to control. Another crash shook the building. This time Ash flinched harder. His claws scraped faintly against the kennel floor as he backed half a step away from the gate before stopping himself. Ethan's chest tightened at the sight. That hesitation, wanting closeness but fearing it at the same time. God, he knew that feeling. The storm winds howled outside, rattling loose tree branches against the roof. Snow hammered sideways across the windows. Somewhere farther down the shelter, a younger dog whined continuously beneath the noise. Ethan kept his voice steady. "Generator will come on soon," he murmured. Old buildings just like being dramatic. No response. But Ash stayed facing him instead of retreating to the wall again. That mattered. Ethan leaned his shoulders back against the concrete beside the kennel and exhaled slowly through his nose. The emergency lights painted faint shadows across the tattoo on his arm, while the dog tags in his hand caught tiny flashes of dim red light. Ranger's name glinted softly in the darkness. Another thunderclap rolled low and deep across the valley. Ash's ears lowered farther. Ethan looked at him quietly for a long moment before speaking again. You know what nobody tells you about survival. His voice barely rose above the storm now. Sometimes surviving is the loudest part. Ash's amber eyes stayed fixed on him through the darkness. Ethan stared down at the concrete floor between them. After Afghanistan, everybody kept congratulating us for coming home alive. He gave a faint, humorless laugh beneath his breath. Funny thing was, some of us did not really come back. The wind outside screamed briefly around the corners of the building. Ethan rubbed his thumb slowly over Ranger's dog tag again. I spent 2 years pretending crowds did not make my skin crawl. His jaw tightened slightly. Pretending fireworks sounded normal. Another crash of thunder interrupted him. Ash jerked faintly this time, then immediately looked toward Ethan again. Searching. Ethan noticed that too. Yeah, he whispered softly. I hate loud noises too. The darkness between them no longer felt empty now. It felt shared. The kind of quiet that only existed between wounded things trying not to scare each other away. Somewhere behind the kennel rose, the receptionist cursed softly as another door slammed shut in the wind near the front entrance. Flashlight beams moved through the distant hallway while the storm continued pressing against the shelter like an ocean against old wood. Ethan remained seated on the cold concrete floor. Ranger used to lean against my leg during storms, he said quietly after a moment. Not because he was scared. A faint smile touched his face. Because he thought I was. Ash lowered his head slightly while listening. Ethan could barely make out the outline of the shepherd's body now beneath the dim emergency glow. Truth is, Ethan admitted softly, he was usually right. Thunder rolled again. Longer this time. Ash's breathing quickened visibly. His paws shifted against the concrete floor. Ethan recognized the signs immediately now. The shepherd was fighting instinct. Fighting memory. Fighting the urge to disappear back into the safety of isolation. Ethan slowly moved one hand closer toward the kennel gate. Not reaching through. Just resting his fingers near the chain link. You do not have to come closer, he said quietly. I just need you to know somebody stayed. The words hung softly in the dark between them. Simple words. But something changed after Ethan spoke them. Ash stared at the hand resting near the gate for several long seconds while thunder rolled again outside the shelter. The shepherd's ears twitched faintly. Then slowly, carefully, he took one step forward. Ethan did not move. Ash lowered his nose toward the chain-link gate. Inches away now. His breathing trembled faintly in the cold darkness while he studied Ethan's scent with painful caution. Another flash of lightning illuminated the kennel row bright white for half a second. And in that instant Ethan saw it clearly. Ash was terrified. Not of him. Of needing someone again. Ethan felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. I know, he whispered softly. The emergency lights flickered weakly overhead. Ash hesitated only a second longer before finally pressing the front of his muzzle gently against the chain link beside Ethan's hand. No barking. No dramatic movement. Just quiet contact in the dark. But for a dog who had not trusted another living soul in 217 days, it felt like watching winter thaw 1 single inch at a time. For several seconds, neither of them moved. The storm continued roaring outside the shelter walls, thunder rolling low across the mountains while snow lashed the windows in thick white sheets. Yet inside that dim kennel hallway, the world had narrowed into something painfully small and fragile. A tired Marine sitting on cold concrete. A silent German shepherd pressing his muzzle gently against chain link for the first time in months. Ethan kept his hand still beside the gate. He understood better than most that trust could vanish the moment somebody rushed it. Ash's breathing trembled faintly against the metal links while his amber eyes stayed fixed on Ethan through the darkness. The shepherd looked exhausted by the effort alone. Like reaching toward another living thing required strength he no longer knew he still had. Ethan swallowed hard around the tightness gathering quietly in his throat. Good boy, he whispered softly. The words barely rose above the storm. But Ash heard them. Ethan saw it immediately in the faint twitch of the shepherd's ears. Not excitement. Recognition. The kind that hurts before it heals. Somewhere near the front office, the backup generator finally groaned to life. Lights flickered weakly overhead one row at a time until the kennel hallway returned in pale, uneven bursts of fluorescent white. The sudden brightness startled several dogs farther down the corridor into fresh barking fits. Ash flinched instinctively at the noise, but did not retreat from the kennel door this time. Ethan noticed that too. That is progress, he murmured quietly. Ash slowly pulled his muzzle back from the chain link. Though he remained close enough that Ethan could see tiny silver strands beginning to appear around the shepherd's face beneath the harsh light. Older than 5 maybe. Hard-living, aged dogs faster. Sometimes. The hallway door creaked open behind them. Martha stepped cautiously into view carrying a flashlight she no longer needed. Her eyes widened the moment she saw Ash still near the front of the kennel. "Oh my lord," she whispered softly. Ethan glanced back over one shoulder while remaining seated beside the gate. Martha lowered the flashlight slowly at her side. "He stayed there?" she asked almost breathlessly. Ethan nodded once. Martha looked at Ash carefully as though afraid sudden movement might break the moment apart. "Usually after storms or loud noises he shuts down completely," she said quietly. "Back wall. Won't look at anybody for days." Ash glanced briefly toward her voice, but kept most of his attention on Ethan. Martha noticed immediately. Her expression softened into something almost emotional. "I have not seen him this calm since he first arrived." Ethan looked back toward the shepherd again. Calm was not exactly the word he would have chosen. Ash still carried tension through every line of his body. But beneath it now sat something else. Awareness. The dog was no longer hiding from the room. Martha stepped closer carefully. "We found him during the first snow last year," she said softly. "Animal control called us after neighbors complained about a dog sitting on the porch of an abandoned house for nearly 3 days straight." Ethan listened quietly while Ash lowered himself slowly onto the kennel floor near the gate, instead of retreating to the corner. "Nobody knew how long he had been there before that," Martha continued. "No owner came forward. No chip. Nothing." The fluorescent light overhead buzzed softly again. "He was starving when they brought him in," she whispered. But even then, he kept staring at the front entrance like he expected someone to walk through the door. Ethan felt something heavy settle quietly inside his chest. Waiting. Dogs always waited longer than people deserved. Martha glanced toward Ash sadly. At first he would pace every evening around 6 o'clock. She gave a faint shake of her head. Same exact time every day. Ethan looked at the shepherd lying silently near the gate now. "What happened?" Martha's eyes dimmed slightly. "Nothing." The word lingered painfully in the cold hallway. That was the problem. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly. He understood. Hope did not always die dramatically. Sometimes it simply wore itself out waiting. Martha folded her arms against the chill. After a few months, he stopped reacting altogether. She hesitated. "We almost thought something was medically wrong with him." Ash rested his head slowly across his front paws now, while continuing to watch Ethan carefully. Martha noticed again. "He trusts you," she said softly. Ethan let out a quiet breath. "I think he is trying to." Outside, wind howled through the trees surrounding the shelter, while snow continued piling against the parking lot lamps in frozen waves. It was getting late now. Ethan could feel the exhaustion settling into his bones the way winter cold always did. But leaving suddenly felt impossible. Martha checked the old clock hanging crookedly near the hallway entrance. "Roads are going to get dangerous soon," she said gently. Ethan nodded once, though his eyes remained on Ash. "Yeah." Neither man nor dog moved. Martha studied the windows, then glanced toward the emergency radio on her belt. The county had already issued a no-travel advisory for the northern roads. 2 volunteers had called to say they were turning back before the bridge. Ethan could try to drive to the lake, but she knew that route. One wrong slide past the guardrail, and the storm would swallow a truck whole. "You can stay in the staff room until the plows come through," she said at last. "Not because this is a hotel, and not because I usually allow it. Because tonight the roads are worse than my rules." Ethan looked at her, surprised by the practical kindness. "I do not want to cause trouble. You already donated half a storage unit and got our most unreachable dog to look at you," Martha replied. "That is not trouble. That is the first useful miracle we have had all week." Martha studied them for a long, quiet moment before speaking again. "You know," she said softly, "some animals only bond once in their lifetime." Ethan glanced toward her. "Working dogs especially." She looked at Ash carefully. "If they lose their person," her voice trailed off gently into the fluorescent hum surrounding them. Ethan rubbed his hands slowly together for warmth. "You saying he belongs to somebody already?" Martha shook her head faintly. "No," she smiled sadly. I think maybe he just forgot what it felt like to belong anywhere at all. The words settled deeply into the room. Ethan looked back toward Ash again. The shepherd's eyes remained fixed on him now with quiet intensity. Not desperate, not needy, just present. For a long moment Ethan could not breathe quite right. Because somewhere beneath the storm, beneath the grief, beneath all the years both of them had spent surviving separately in silence, something impossible had started happening inside that old shelter hallway. Neither of them looked alone anymore. The storm did not ease for another hour. Snow buried the parking lot in thick, uneven drifts while icy wind moaned through the pine trees surrounding Silver Pine's rescue like something alive in the dark. Most of the volunteers had already gone home by then. Only Martha remained near the front office finishing paperwork beneath a dim desk lamp while old country music played softly from a tiny radio beside the coffee machine. The rest of the shelter settled slowly into nighttime quiet. Dogs finally stopped barking one by one until only the occasional whimper or shifting chain link sound drifted through the halls. Ethan still sat beside Ash's kennel. Somewhere during the last hour, neither of them had noticed how late it became. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed steadily now that the generator had stabilized, washing the hallway in tired pale light. Ash remained stretched near the front gate instead of hiding in the corner. Sometimes he closed his eyes briefly. Sometimes he watched Ethan silently, but he no longer turned away. Ethan rested his head lightly against the concrete wall behind him, exhaustion pulling at the edges of his body. The warmth inside the building mixed with the distant sound of wind outside in a way that made the whole shelter feel strangely suspended from time. Safe for the moment. You ever get tired of remembering? Ethan asked quietly into the stillness. Ash's ears twitched faintly at the sound of his voice. Ethan stared at the ceiling lights overhead. That is the part nobody warns you about. His fingers rolled Ranger's dog tags slowly between his knuckles. People think grief comes from losing somebody. He swallowed once. Truth is, grief comes from remembering them constantly afterward. Ash lifted his head slightly from his paws now. Ethan gave a faint, tired smile. Yeah, I know. Somewhere outside, a snowplow rumbled faintly along the distant highway before disappearing again beneath the storm winds. Ethan closed his eyes for a second, listening. Cabin gets loud at night sometimes, he admitted softly. Not real loud. His jaw tightened slightly. Just memories. Ash watched him quietly beneath the pale light. Ethan could almost imagine Ranger sitting there instead for one dangerous second. Same intelligent eyes. Same stillness. Same feeling that somebody was listening without needing words. He forced the thought away gently before it could hurt too much. I stopped inviting people over after a while, Ethan continued. Friends would ask if I was okay. A faint, humorless laugh escaped him. Funny question. He rubbed tiredly at his eyes. How exactly is somebody supposed to answer that? Ash slowly shifted his front paws closer to the kennel gate. Tiny movement, but deliberate. Ethan noticed immediately now. The shepherd was inching toward him little by little without seeming to realize it himself. Most people just want easy answers, Ethan murmured. I learned that after deployment. He glanced toward Ash again. You tell them the truth and suddenly the room gets uncomfortable. The shelter heater rattled softly back to life overhead, pushing warm air through the hallway vents. Ash let out a slow breath through his nose and lowered his chin back onto his paws, though his eyes remained open now instead of distant. Present. Ethan looked at him quietly for a long moment. You know what I think happened to you? He asked softly. Ash blinked once. I think somebody left without understanding they were taking the whole world with them. Silence followed. Deep. Heavy. Honest. Ethan stared at the shepherd's tired face beneath the fluorescent glow. That kind of thing changes a creature. Martha appeared quietly near the hallway entrance carrying 2 steaming paper cups. She paused when she saw Ethan still sitting there. Thought you might need coffee, she said gently. Ethan looked up and accepted one with a grateful nod. Thanks. Martha leaned lightly against the wall beside him. Road crews are recommending nobody drives tonight, she said softly. Highway visibility is almost gone. Ethan glanced toward the dark windows at the end of the hallway. Snow pressed thick against the glass now. Would not be the first night I slept somewhere uncomfortable. Martha smiled faintly before looking toward Ash. Her expression softened immediately. He keeps watching you. Ethan looked back toward the shepherd again. Ash did not look away this time, even with Martha nearby. Guess we are both bad at letting people leave, Ethan murmured. Martha stayed quiet for a moment before speaking carefully. There is something else you should know. Ethan glanced toward her. Martha folded her hands around her coffee cup slowly. County funding reviews happen every February. Her voice lowered slightly. Dogs that stay too long without progress. She hesitated. Ethan's expression hardened immediately. What does that mean? Martha looked down briefly. It means shelters like ours do not always get unlimited time. The heater hummed softly overhead while the storm continued outside. Ethan felt cold settle sharply through his chest despite the warm coffee in his hands. How long? He asked quietly. Martha sighed. Board meets next week. Ethan stared toward Ash again. She hated how cold the explanation sounded, so she forced herself to say the rest plainly. Ash was not scheduled for euthanasia that morning. Nobody at Silver Pines wanted that. But when county numbers tightened, difficult dogs were moved first. Quiet dogs, old dogs, dogs with no adoption interest and no obvious story volunteers could turn into a cheerful post online. Transfers sounded gentle on paper, but Martha had seen what happened when a shut-down shepherd was moved from one crowded facility to another, losing scent, routine, and the few fragile anchors he still had. Some animals survived the transport. Some never emotionally came back from it. He needs progress documented, she said softly. He needs someone willing to take responsibility for him before strangers with spreadsheets decide he is only taking up space. The shepherd had gone perfectly still now, watching both of them carefully as if sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere even without understanding the words. Martha's eyes looked tired suddenly. I have fought for him every month since he arrived. She swallowed softly. But some people only see numbers now. Ethan said nothing. The old ache behind his ribs tightened slowly. Ash lowered his head slightly again, though his eyes never left Ethan's face. The shelter hallway fell silent except for distant wind and the soft ticking of old heating pipes. Ethan looked at the dog for a very long time before finally speaking. Nobody ever stayed long enough for you, did they? Ash remained motionless beneath the pale fluorescent light. But for the first time since arriving at the shelter, Ethan noticed the shepherd's tail resting quietly against the concrete floor near the gate instead of curled protectively beneath his body. Small things. Tiny things. The kind most people would never notice. But wounded souls always notice the smallest signs first, because sometimes survival depended on them. The coffee had gone cold by the time Martha finally drifted back toward the front office to finish closing paperwork. Midnight crept quietly over the shelter while the storm outside buried the roads deeper beneath snow and wind. Ethan remained seated beside the kennel long after the building settled into silence again. Ash had not moved far from the gate once during the last hour. The shepherd rested on the concrete floor beneath the fluorescent light with his head lowered across his paws, though his eyes stayed half open now, tracking Ethan's every movement without fear. The difference was subtle, tiny, but real. Ethan noticed himself relaxing around the dog in ways he had not relaxed around another living creature in years. His shoulders no longer stayed locked tight. His breathing slowed naturally instead of remaining measured and alert. The strange thing was, neither of them seemed to require anything from the other except presence. No performance. No explanations. Just quiet company against the storm. Ethan leaned his head back against the wall again and closed his eyes briefly. The exhaustion in his body felt heavier now that the adrenaline from the storm had faded. Outside, snowplows scraped faintly along distant roads while wind hissed through the pine trees surrounding the shelter grounds. Somewhere down the hallway, one of the older dogs snored softly inside its kennel. The sound almost made Ethan smile. Then suddenly he heard it. Not loud, barely more than air shifting. Ethan opened his eyes slowly. Ash was still lying near the gate, amber eyes fixed calmly on him beneath the pale light. The shepherd's chest rose gently with each breath. Ethan stayed still, listening carefully. There it was again, a soft rumbling sound deep in the dog's throat. Not a growl, not distress. Ethan's breath caught slightly. Was that you? He whispered. Ash blinked once slowly. Then the faint sound came again. Tiny, gravelly from disuse. Almost like the beginning of a sigh. Ethan stared at the shepherd in stunned silence. 217 days without making a sound. Martha had said it herself. Yet now, in the middle of a winter storm beside a tired Marine neither the world nor the shelter fully understood, the silent dog was trying to speak again. Ethan felt something tighten painfully behind his ribs. "Hey," he whispered softly, leaning forward slightly. "Easy, buddy." Ash lowered his ears faintly, watching Ethan carefully as though uncertain whether the sound had been allowed to exist. Ethan gave the smallest smile. "You do not have to stay quiet forever." The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, while snow continued drifting past the high windows in ghostly white waves. Ash shifted carefully onto one side now, body relaxing inch by inch against the concrete floor. Ethan noticed another small miracle immediately. The shepherd's tail moved once against the ground. Slow, hesitant, barely a tap, but movement. All the same. Ethan exhaled quietly through his nose and rubbed tired fingers across his jaw. "You are really trying, huh?" Another tiny rumble escaped Ash's throat. The sound cracked awkwardly midway through as though his voice itself had forgotten how to work properly. Ethan looked down for a second, suddenly overwhelmed by something he could not fully explain. Hope frightened him more than loneliness ever had. Loneliness became predictable eventually. Hope could break you all over again. He swallowed hard and stared at Ranger's dog tags resting in his palm beneath the fluorescent glow. "You know what the problem is?" he murmured quietly after a long silence. "The second you start caring about something again," his voice faded softly. Ash watched him without moving. Ethan looked toward the dog again. "You also start fearing losing it." The heater clicked on overhead with a low mechanical groan. Warm air drifted slowly into the hallway, carrying the smell of dust and old blankets. Ash rested his chin fully against the floor now, while continuing to study Ethan with quiet focus. The shepherd no longer looked empty. Tired, yes. Scarred maybe forever, but no longer absent. Ethan could see the soul returning piece by piece behind those amber eyes. And somehow that terrified him, because part of him already knew what came next. Attachment, responsibility, the possibility of heartbreak all over again. Ethan closed his eyes briefly and rubbed both hands across his face. "I cannot do this again," he whispered softly, almost to himself. Ash's ears twitched faintly at the change in Ethan's voice. "I barely survived losing one partner already." The words hung quietly in the cold air. Ethan stared at the concrete floor for several long seconds before continuing. "People think soldiers are scared of dying." He shook his head faintly. "Most of us are scared of surviving after everybody else is gone." The shelter remained silent around them except for distant wind brushing snow against the building walls. Ethan finally looked toward Ash again. The shepherd had lifted his head now, eyes fixed completely on Ethan's face with an intensity that almost hurt to meet directly. Then, slowly, carefully, Ash stood up. Ethan froze instinctively. The shepherd stepped toward the kennel gate, one measured movement at a time, until he stood directly in front of Ethan beneath the fluorescent light. Close enough now that Ethan could see tiny flecks of gray hidden around the dog's muzzle. Close enough to notice the old scar near Ash's shoulder beneath the sable fur. The shepherd lowered his head slowly toward the chain link. Ethan's breathing tightened slightly. Ash stared at him for one long silent moment. Then, with heartbreaking caution, the German shepherd gently pressed the side of his face against Ethan's hand resting near the kennel door. Full contact this time. Warm fur against skin. Ethan shut his eyes immediately as emotion hit him, so suddenly it almost felt physical. The dog stayed there quietly, leaning the slightest amount of weight into his hand, as though testing whether comfort still existed in the world. Ethan's throat tightened hard. He had forgotten what trust felt like when it arrived without words. Ethan did not pull his hand away. He could not. The warmth of Ash's face resting carefully against his skin felt too fragile, too honest to disturb. The shepherd stayed perfectly still beside the kennel gate, amber eyes half lowered beneath the fluorescent light, while snow continued whispering against the shelter windows outside. For one long moment the storm, the exhaustion, the years of grief hanging off both their shoulders seemed to fade into the background. There was only quiet contact, living warmth, trust returning inch by inch to two souls that had nearly forgotten what it felt like. Ethan swallowed hard against the pressure building painfully behind his ribs. He had spent years teaching himself not to need things anymore. It was safer that way. Safer to keep the cabin quiet. Safer to drive alone. Safer not to attach himself to creatures capable of leaving holes behind when they disappeared. Yet the German shepherd leaning gently into his hand beneath the pale shelter lights was undoing those walls without making a sound. Ash's breathing slowed steadily now. Calm. Present. The shepherd closed his eyes briefly for half a second, before opening them again to make sure Ethan was still there. Ethan felt something inside his chest crack softly at the sight. "Nobody touched you in a long time, did they?" he whispered. Ash's ears twitched faintly. Ethan carefully moved his fingers along the chain link, barely brushing the fur near the shepherd's jaw through the metal openings. Slow enough not to startle him. Ash did not retreat. Instead, the dog leaned the smallest amount closer. Outside, the storm finally began losing some of its anger. Wind still pushed snow across the parking lot in frozen spirals, but the thunder had faded deeper into the mountains now. The shelter itself felt suspended in soft midnight stillness. Ethan let out a slow breath. "You know what is funny?" he murmured quietly. "Everybody thinks soldiers are good at carrying pain." His thumb moved gently against Ash's fur through the fence. "Truth is, we just get better at hiding where it hurts." Ash stared at him with painful attentiveness now, as though every word mattered. Ethan looked down at Ranger's dog tags, still resting loosely in his other hand. "After Ranger died," he said softly, "people kept telling me to move forward." A faint, tired smile crossed his face. "Like grief was a hallway you eventually walked out of." The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. "But some losses do not end," he whispered. "You just learn how to limp beside them." Ash lowered himself carefully back onto the concrete floor without breaking contact completely. One side of his face still rested near Ethan's hand at the gate. The shepherd looked exhausted but peaceful in a way Ethan doubted anyone at the shelter had seen before. Somewhere near the front office, Martha quietly turned off the old radio. Silence settled deeper through the building afterward. Ethan remained there beside the kennel long enough for his coffee to become completely cold in his untouched cup. He no longer cared. Sleepiness tugged heavily behind his eyes now, but leaving still felt impossible. Not after this. Not after the way Ash looked at him now, like somebody who had finally stopped waiting for the world to end. Then Martha's footsteps echoed softly down the hallway again. She stopped when she saw Ash lying near the gate beside Ethan. One hand slowly covered her mouth. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered toward the dog, emotion thickening her voice. Ethan glanced up quietly. Martha looked close to tears beneath the fluorescent glow. "He used to do that with his owner," she murmured softly. Ethan's chest tightened instantly. "You knew him before?" Martha nodded faintly while stepping closer. "Not personally." Her eyes stayed on Ash. "But a deputy recognized him months ago after we posted shelter photos online." Ethan listened carefully now. Martha folded her arms against the chill. His owner was a veteran named Daniel Mercer. The name lingered quietly in the hallway. Lived alone outside Kalispell. Ethan looked back toward Ash instinctively. The shepherd's ears lifted faintly at the sound of the familiar voice speaking nearby. "Deputy said those two were inseparable," Martha continued softly. "Dog followed him everywhere." She hesitated. Then one winter morning Daniel suffered a heart attack while shoveling snow outside his cabin. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs slowly. Martha's eyes dimmed sadly. Neighbors found him too late. Silence settled heavily around the kennel. Ash stayed motionless beside Ethan's hand, but his breathing had changed again. Slower now. Deeper somehow. Martha swallowed softly before continuing. "The deputy believes Ash stayed on the porch afterward waiting for him to come home." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. God. Dogs. Always waiting. Animal control could never fully reach him emotionally after that, Martha whispered. He stopped responding once they brought him here. Ethan stared down at the shepherd lying quietly beside the gate. Suddenly everything made terrible sense. The waiting. The silence. The way Ash watched entrances like somebody searching for footsteps that would never return. Ethan rubbed his thumb gently against the fur near Ash's cheek through the fence. "You lost your person too," he whispered. Ash's eyes slowly lifted toward him. There was no emptiness in them anymore. Only grief. Familiar grief. The kind Ethan recognized immediately because he carried the human version of it every single day. Martha wiped quietly beneath one eye before speaking again. "I think he finally understands something tonight." Ethan glanced toward her. Martha looked at the shepherd sadly. "That somebody stayed after the storm." Ethan looked back toward Ash again. The shepherd watched him in complete silence beneath the pale fluorescent lights while snow drifted softly against the dark windows beyond them. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt something dangerous beginning to rise quietly beneath all the grief he carried. Not happiness. Not yet. Just the terrifying possibility that maybe neither of them had been abandoned by the world completely after all. By 3 in the morning, the storm had finally weakened into soft, drifting snow. The shelter sat wrapped in deep winter silence beneath a sky the color of charcoal ash. Inside the kennel hallway, only half the fluorescent lights remained on now, casting long pale reflections across the concrete floor. Ethan had not slept. He sat with his back against the wall beside Ash's kennel while exhaustion settled heavy beneath his eyes. But strangely, he did not feel trapped by the sleeplessness tonight. The old panic that usually accompanied long silent hours had loosened its grip somehow. Ash remained stretched near the kennel gate close enough that Ethan could still feel faint warmth radiating through the chain link whenever he rested his hand nearby. Neither of them seemed ready to break the quiet between them yet. Somewhere near the front office, Martha shuffled papers softly while an old heater hummed against the cold. Ethan stared down at Ranger's dog tags, turning slowly through his fingers again. Daniel Mercer. The name lingered heavily in his mind now. A man gone long before either he or Ash had learned how to survive the absence properly. Ethan understood that kind of unfinished grief too well. You stayed on the porch waiting for him. He whispered quietly toward the shepherd. Ash lifted his eyes slowly at the sound of Ethan's voice. Even after everybody else gave up, the shepherd remained still beneath the fluorescent glow, but his ears twitched faintly forward now instead of flattening away. Ethan gave the smallest tired smile. Loyal to the bitter end, huh? Ash blinked once. Ethan looked down at the dog tags in his hand again. Ranger used to wait outside the shower room after training, he murmured softly. Every single time. A quiet breath escaped him. Did not matter if it took 5 minutes or an hour. The corner of his mouth twitched faintly with memory. He hated not knowing where I was. Snow brushed gently against the windows high above the kennel rows. The whole building smelled faintly of old blankets, dust, coffee, and wet winter air drifting beneath the doors. Ethan leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes briefly. Funny thing about dogs, he whispered. They never understand why people disappear. Ash lowered his head slowly onto his paws again while listening. Ethan swallowed hard around the ache gathering in his chest. Truth is, his voice grew rougher. Sometimes neither do we. Silence settled softly between them again. Not uncomfortable, just honest. Ethan stared at the shepherd for a long moment beneath the pale, overhead light. I should leave before sunrise, he admitted quietly. The words felt wrong immediately after saying them. Ash's ears lowered faintly. Ethan noticed at once. God. The dog understood tone too well. Roads will clear by morning. Ethan continued softly, almost explaining himself to the shepherd now. I still have work Monday. Ash did not move, but something changed behind his eyes again. Not panic, not retreat, just that familiar guarded stillness wounded creatures carried whenever abandonment brushed too close. Ethan's chest tightened painfully at the sight. He rubbed tiredly at the back of his neck. Do not do that, he muttered softly. Ash blinked slowly. Ethan exhaled sharply through his nose. Do not look at me like I already left. The shelter heater groaned overhead. Somewhere farther down the kennel row, another dog shifted quietly in sleep. Ethan looked away toward the windows for several seconds before speaking again. You know what the worst part is? He whispered. Part of me walked in here tonight planning to survive alone forever. He laughed softly, beneath his breath without humor. Then you had to go and make eye contact. Ash watched him carefully beneath the fluorescent light. Ethan rubbed his thumb slowly across Ranger's engraved dog tag. I do not know if I can lose another partner, he admitted quietly. And I definitely do not know if you can survive losing another person. The words hung heavy between them. Ash slowly rose from the kennel floor then. Ethan froze slightly, watching. The shepherd stepped toward the gate again with careful, deliberate movements until he stood directly in front of Ethan beneath the pale light. His amber eyes remained locked quietly on Ethan's face. Then Ash did something Martha had probably not seen in months. The German shepherd sat down directly beside the kennel door, facing Ethan instead of the wall. Waiting. Present. Choosing connection openly now despite the risk. Ethan felt emotion hit him so suddenly he had to look away for a second. Damn it, he whispered hoarsely. Ash tilted his head faintly at the sound. Ethan shut his eyes hard for a moment. The memory came back without warning then. Afghanistan. Dust thick in the air. Ranger sitting beside him before deployment transport lifted off at dawn. The same steady eyes. The same silent certainty that loyalty mattered more than fear. Ethan pressed the heel of his hand briefly against his forehead. I am trying not to need this, he admitted softly. Ash remained exactly where he was, still waiting beside the kennel door. Ethan finally looked toward him again. The shepherd's tail rested quietly against the concrete floor, now fully relaxed instead of tucked protectively beneath him. Tiny details. Tiny miracles. Ethan stared at the dog for a very long time before slowly standing to his feet. His knees cracked stiffly after sitting so many hours on concrete. Ash rose immediately too, following the movement with quiet alertness. Ethan stepped closer to the kennel gate now until only the chain link separated them. The shepherd lifted his face slowly toward him. Ethan swallowed once hard before reaching carefully through the kennel opening for the first time that night. Ash froze. So did Ethan. No sudden movement. No pressure. Just trembling silence beneath fluorescent lights and falling snow. Then slowly, impossibly gently, Ash leaned forward and rested the full weight of his head into Ethan's palm. The moment Ash placed the full weight of his head into Ethan's palm, something inside the Marine finally gave way. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, like ice cracking beneath the first warmth of spring. Ethan stood frozen beside the kennel gate, while the shepherd remained perfectly still beneath his hand. Warm fur, slow breathing, trust, real trust, the kind that only comes after pain has stripped everything else away. Ethan's fingers trembled faintly against Ash's sable coat as he carefully stroked behind the dog's ear. Ash closed his eyes immediately. The reaction hit Ethan harder than he expected. God. The shepherd looked exhausted by comfort itself. Like nobody had touched him gently in so long that his entire body no longer knew how to process kindness without fear attached to it. Ethan swallowed hard. Easy, buddy, he whispered softly. Ash leaned deeper into his hand. Outside, snow drifted softly through the dark Montana night beneath parking lot lights glowing pale gold against the storm's fading remains. The shelter had become impossibly quiet now. No barking, no rattling gates. Just the steady hum of fluorescent lights and the soft sound of one wounded dog trusting somebody again for the first time in nearly a year. Ethan rested his forehead briefly against the cold chain-link fence and shut his eyes. He could feel tears threatening now. Not sudden tears. Old ones. The kind grief stores quietly in a man until something gentle finally reaches the place he buried them. Ash remained pressed against his hand without moving away. Ethan let out a shaky breath. You should not have done that, he murmured hoarsely. The shepherd opened his eyes slowly. Ethan gave a weak, tired laugh beneath his breath. Now I am attached. Somewhere down the hallway, Martha quietly stopped walking. Ethan had not heard her approach, but he sensed her standing there now witnessing the moment in silence. Neither she nor Ethan spoke. Some things became sacred if left quiet long enough. Ash finally shifted slightly beneath Ethan's hand. Not retreating, but guiding the touch farther along his neck. Ethan felt another crack spread softly through the walls around his heart. The shepherd trusted him now. Not completely perhaps, but enough. Enough to stop hiding. Enough to stop waiting for abandonment every second. Ethan rubbed carefully along the thick fur near Ash's collarbone while the dog leaned subtly closer. There you are, Ethan whispered. Been a while since somebody found you, huh? Ash's tail moved once slowly against the concrete floor. Ethan closed his eyes again for half a second. He remembered another tail doing the same thing years ago inside dusty military barracks after long patrols overseas. Ranger used to lean against his leg exactly like this whenever nightmares left Ethan pacing sleepless through the night. No words. No fixing things. Just presence. Dogs understood that healing rarely happened through speeches. Sometimes survival only needed somebody willing to stay beside the pain without running from it. Ethan finally opened his eyes again and looked directly into Ash's face beneath the fluorescent light. The shepherd no longer looked hollow now. Tired, yes. Scarred deeply, but alive again somehow. Present. Ethan could see emotion returning behind those amber eyes little by little. Cautious hope. Fragile connection. The terrifying possibility that maybe life still held something gentle worth reaching toward. Martha stepped closer quietly at last, her voice barely above a whisper. I have never seen him do this. Ethan looked toward her slowly, while keeping one hand resting against Ash's neck. Martha's eyes glistened softly beneath the pale overhead lights. "Not once," she said. Ethan glanced back at the shepherd again. Ash never took his eyes off him now. Martha folded her arms loosely against the chill and gave a faint, sad smile. Daniel used to sit beside him exactly like that. Ethan's chest tightened painfully again at the name. Daniel Mercer. Another lonely veteran. Another man who probably understood silence better than conversation. Ethan looked down toward the concrete floor for several seconds before speaking. "What happens if nobody adopts him before the meeting?" Martha hesitated too long. Ethan already knew the answer before she spoke. "County transfers," she said softly. "Sometimes overcrowded shelters." Her voice grew quieter. "Sometimes facilities farther south." Ethan looked back toward Ash instinctively. The shepherd remained calm only because Ethan's hand still rested against him. And dogs like him? Martha's silence said enough. Ethan felt something sharp settle heavily behind his ribs. Ash finally blinked slowly beneath his hand, completely unaware that strangers in offices were deciding whether his future still mattered. Ethan stared at him for a very long time. The shepherd trusted again now. Trusted enough to lean into human touch after months of emotional starvation. Trusted enough to stop hiding from the world. And somehow that made the possibility of losing him feel unbearable already. Ethan withdrew his hand slowly from the kennel opening at last. Ash immediately lifted his head, ears lowering faintly with uncertainty. Ethan felt guilt strike him instantly at the reaction. "Hey," he whispered softly. "I am still here." The shepherd relaxed slightly again. Ethan rubbed tiredly at his face before standing fully upright. His back ached from hours against concrete walls. Dawn still sat at least 2 hours away beyond the storm clouds. Martha studied him quietly. "You were thinking about it." Ethan stared toward Ash again. The shepherd remained seated beside the kennel gate watching him with quiet, unwavering focus. "That is the problem," Ethan admitted softly. "I stopped thinking about anything else hours ago." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead while snow continued drifting gently outside the windows, now softer and calmer than before. Ethan looked at Ash for another long moment before finally stepping closer to the kennel door again. The shepherd rose instantly to meet him. Ethan rested one hand lightly against the chain link between them. "You waited for somebody who never came back," he whispered softly to the dog. Ash's ears twitched faintly. Ethan swallowed hard. "I know exactly how that feels." And standing there beneath tired shelter lights with winter pressing softly against the windows, Ethan realized something that frightened him more than loneliness ever had. He no longer wanted to walk away alone. Dawn arrived slowly over Montana like a tired prayer whispered across snow-covered mountains. Pale blue light filtered through the shelter windows while the storm finally settled into silence outside. The world beyond the glass looked untouched now. Pine trees bowed beneath fresh snow. The parking lot sat buried in smooth white drifts glowing softly beneath the fading street lamps. Inside Silver Pine's rescue, the fluorescent lights seemed less harsh in the early morning calm. Ethan stood beside Ash's kennel watching the first traces of sunrise touch the windows near the ceiling. He had not left. At some point during the long night, exhaustion stopped mattering. Ash remained seated directly beside the gate, close enough that Ethan could still rest his fingers lightly against the shepherd's neck through the chain link whenever he wanted. The dog no longer flinched from touch now, no longer hid in corners. Every few minutes Ash glanced toward the front entrance automatically, old habits refusing to disappear overnight. But each time his eyes drifted back toward Ethan afterward, choosing the present instead of ghosts. Martha shuffled quietly down the hallway carrying fresh coffee and paperwork. She looked exhausted but relieved somehow. "Road crews finally cleared Highway 35, she said softly. Ethan nodded absently without taking his eyes off Ash. Martha noticed immediately. "You still have not decided." Ethan let out a tired breath through his nose. "I already decided hours ago." Martha studied him carefully. "Then what is stopping you?" Ethan finally looked toward her. There it was. The real fear sitting beneath everything else. "What if I fail him?" he asked quietly. Martha's expression softened instantly. Ethan glanced back toward Ash again. "What if I cannot be what he needs?" The old volunteer stayed silent for a long moment before answering. "You stayed all night beside a dog everyone else gave up on." Her voice remained gentle. "That already makes you more than most people." Ethan rubbed tiredly at the Back of his neck. I mean long term. He swallowed once hard. I barely know how to take care of myself anymore. Ash slowly rose from the kennel floor then and stepped closer until his shoulder rested lightly against the chain link near Ethan's arm. The movement silenced the hallway completely. Martha smiled faintly beneath tired eyes. Looks like he disagrees. Ethan stared at the shepherd quietly. Ash looked calmer in daylight somehow. Still thin. Still carrying old grief in the heaviness around his eyes. But alive now. Present. Ethan realized suddenly that the shelter no longer smelled cold and lonely the way it had when he first walked inside yesterday evening. Strange how connection changed the atmosphere around suffering. Martha stepped closer with the paperwork tucked beneath one arm. If you want him, she said softly, the board meeting would not matter anymore. Ethan looked toward the forms in her hands. Adoption papers. Technically, there would still be steps. A veterinarian would sign off on his weight, his vaccines, his old shoulder scar. A home visit would have to be scheduled. For a dog like Ash, Martha would mark the file as a foster-to-adopt placement for the first 30 days, with follow-up calls every week and the right to bring him back if fear became too much for either of them. It was not a fairy tale shortcut. It was the most careful door the shelter could open. But the most important part had already happened in front of her. Ash had chosen to stand close to a human again. Ethan had chosen not to rush him. Paperwork could record that later. The truth of it was already breathing between them. Something inside his chest tightened immediately. Finality. Responsibility. Hope. The dangerous kind. Ash watched him carefully beneath the morning light, ears tilted forward with quiet uncertainty. Ethan crouched slowly beside the kennel gate again until he stood eye level with the shepherd. You really want to take another chance on a broken marine? He murmured softly. Ash stared at him for exactly 2 seconds before lifting his head and pressing gently into Ethan's hand again. The simplest answer possible. Ethan shut his eyes briefly as emotion moved through him like something warm finally reaching frozen ground. Martha quietly looked away to give him the dignity of the moment. Ethan exhaled shakily through his nose before finally nodding once. All right, he whispered. Ash's ears lifted immediately. Ethan almost laughed at the sudden alertness. Yeah, he murmured softly. I think you already knew. Martha wiped discreetly beneath one eye before opening the kennel door slowly for the first time. The metal latch clicked softly in the quiet hallway. Ethan's breath caught slightly. So did Ash's. The shepherd remained motionless at first, staring at the open door as though unsure it was real. Martha stepped back carefully. Take your time, sweetheart, she whispered toward the dog. Ethan stayed crouched beside the doorway without reaching forward. No pressure. No commands. Just patience. Ash stared at the open kennel entrance for several long seconds while pale morning light spread softly across the concrete floor. Then slowly, cautiously, the German shepherd stepped out. Ethan felt his throat tighten immediately. Ash paused beside him uncertainly, body tense from instinct more than fear now. Ethan looked up carefully into the shepherd's amber eyes. Hey buddy, he whispered softly. You are okay. Ash inhaled slowly near Ethan's shoulder, testing the scent again now, without chain link between them. Ethan remained perfectly still. Then, in one gentle heartbreaking movement, Ash leaned his entire body against Ethan's chest. Ethan wrapped both arms around the shepherd instinctively before he could stop himself. Warm fur, trembling breath, living trust. The dog did not resist the embrace. He simply stood there leaning quietly into the marine like somebody finally too exhausted to carry grief alone anymore. Ethan pressed one hand carefully against the back of Ash's neck and shut his eyes hard as tears finally slipped free despite every attempt to hold them back. Not loud tears, just silent ones. The kind that arrive after surviving too long without comfort. Ash stayed against him the entire time. Martha turned away completely now, pretending to organize paperwork near the front office while emotion softened. Her tired face. Ethan buried his fingers gently into the thick sable fur around Ash's shoulders and let out one shaky breath after another. I got you, he whispered hoarsely. Ash's tail moved slowly against the concrete floor. Once, twice, and standing there inside a quiet shelter after the longest winter night either of them had known in years, two wounded souls finally stopped waiting for someone who was never coming back. 3 months later, winter still clung to the mountains around Flathead Lake, but the cabin no longer felt empty. Morning light spilled softly through frost-covered windows while pine trees swayed gently beyond the porch beneath a pale Montana sky. Smoke drifted from the cabin chimney in slow gray ribbons, carrying the scent of cedar and coffee into the cold air. Inside, the old house creaked quietly with warmth and life now instead of silence. Ethan stood at the kitchen counter wearing a faded thermal shirt and worn jeans while coffee brewed beside him. The scarred wooden cabin still looked rough around the edges. Stacks of books sat unevenly beside the fireplace. Old military jackets hung near the door. Snow boots dried beside the heater vent. But the loneliness that once haunted every room had begun loosening its grip little by little. A soft rhythmic sound echoed quietly across the floor behind him. Nails against wood. Ethan glanced over his shoulder automatically. Ash walked slowly into the kitchen carrying one of Ethan's old wool socks in his mouth, like some priceless object recovered from battle. The German Shepherd looked stronger now. His sable coat had regained its shine beneath weeks of proper meals and quiet care. Weight filled out his frame again. The hollowness around his ribs had softened. Even his eyes looked different. Still thoughtful. Still carrying old sadness deep inside. But alive now. Awake. Ethan shook his head with a tired smile. That is the third sock this week. Ash sat calmly near the kitchen table without dropping the sock. His ears twitched forward slightly. Ethan laughed softly beneath his breath. The sound still surprised him sometimes. For years, laughter had felt unnatural inside this cabin. Too loud. Too fragile. Now it arrived quietly in moments he never expected. Ethan poured coffee into 2 mugs out of old habit before catching himself midway. He stared at the second cup for a moment, grief brushing softly through him the way winter wind slips beneath a door. Ranger. Daniel Mercer. All the ghosts both he and Ash still carried. Some absences never fully disappeared. But strangely, they no longer felt unbearable either. Ash finally dropped the sock beside Ethan's boots and rested against his leg, while Ethan stood there staring into the steam rising from his coffee mug. The shepherd had started doing that recently. Small moments of contact throughout the day. A shoulder against Ethan's knee while he cooked. A quiet presence beside the couch at night. Tiny reminders that neither of them lived alone anymore. Ethan scratched gently behind Ash's ear. "You know," he murmured softly. "I think you planned this whole thing." Ash's tail tapped once against the wooden floorboards. Outside, sunlight drifted across fresh snow covering the porch where a second set of footprints now appeared beside Ethan's every morning. The first few weeks after bringing Ash home had not been easy. Some nights, thunderstorms rolled over the mountains, and the shepherd would pace silently through the cabin, unable to settle. Some mornings, Ethan woke from old deployment nightmares to find Ash sitting beside the bed, watching over him in the darkness exactly the way Ranger once had. Neither of them healed quickly, but healing came anyway. Slowly, quietly, like snow melting beneath distant spring sunlight. Ethan carried his coffee toward the front porch, while Ash followed closely beside him. The old screen door creaked open against the cold morning air. Snow glittered beneath the sunrise, stretching all the way toward the frozen edge of Flathead Lake in the distance. Ethan lowered himself carefully into the weathered porch chair with a soft groan from stiff knees. Ash settled beside him immediately, shoulder pressed lightly against Ethan's leg beneath a thick wool blanket draped across the chair. For several minutes, neither of them moved. The world stayed quiet except for whine through pine branches and the distant call of crows somewhere across the valley. Ethan breathed slowly, watching sunlight spill gold across the snow-covered mountains. Peace still felt unfamiliar sometimes, but no longer impossible. Ash lifted his head suddenly at movement near the road. A delivery truck rolled slowly past the cabin, carrying fresh mail through the mountain route. Months ago, that sound would have sent the shepherd sprinting toward the porch edge, searching desperately for a man who would never return. Now Ash simply watched the truck pass before leaning calmly back against Ethan again, choosing the present. Ethan felt emotion tighten softly behind his ribs at the tiny moment. "Good boy," he whispered. Ash closed his eyes briefly beneath the gentle praise. Ethan looked down at the shepherd resting beside him. "You know something?" he murmured quietly. "I think Daniel would be glad you stopped waiting." Ash's ears twitched faintly at the sound of the old name, but he did not search the road this time. He stayed exactly where he was, beside Ethan. Home. The Marine stared out across the snow-covered valley for a long moment, while steam drifted slowly from his coffee into the cold air. "Funny thing about broken souls," he said softly. "Everybody thinks they need fixing." He rubbed gently along the thick fur at Ash's neck. "Maybe they just need somebody willing to sit beside them long enough." The morning sunlight warmed slowly across the porch boards while winter birds fluttered through pine branches nearby. Ash let out a deep, relaxed breath against Ethan's leg and finally, after months of silence, made a sound neither fear nor grief had managed to steal from him anymore. A quiet, contented sigh. Ethan closed his eyes briefly at the sound, not because it was loud, but because it was peaceful, truly peaceful. And in that still mountain morning, beside a German shepherd who once believed the world had forgotten him forever, Ethan finally understood something grief had hidden from him for years. Some stories do not end because pain disappears. They end because somebody chooses to stay after the pain arrives. Ash lifted his face toward the rising sun while snow shimmered softly across the mountains around them. He no longer sat facing walls. He no longer waited at empty doors. And for the first time in a very long while, neither did Ethan. So if this story touched something quiet inside you, write one word in the comments tonight. Stay. Write it for every animal who has waited too long, for every person who smiles while quietly falling apart, and for every soul that only needed someone patient enough not to give up after the first silence. And if you believe stories like Ash and Ethan's deserve to be heard, subscribe to the channel before you leave, because sometimes the right story reaches the right person on the very night they almost stopped asking to be saved.